This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, producer of the show. On today's episode, Mike and David are joined by Charles Barone, Senior Director of the Center for Innovation at the National Parents Union, to discuss the future of federal assessment and accountability policies amid political uncertainty. Then, on the Research Minute, Amber shares a study on student loan forgiveness and its impact on earnings, borrowing, and financial behavior. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming this week's special guest, Charlie Barone. Charlie, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks. Good to be here.
Charlie is now the Senior Director of the Center for Innovation at the National Parents Union. Congrats on the new gig, Charlie.
Yeah, for all of about 6 weeks now.
All right, very good. Well, you haven't lost your job yet. That's good.
No.
That's a good sign. and joining us as always, another man whose job is very safe, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Always a pleasure. Nice to hear that.
Yes. Hey, man, we can't take these things for granted. A lot of people in our world are, of course, struggling and worried about keeping jobs. What with all of the doging happening in DC and beyond, so we will take it. And speaking of Doge, we are going to talk about federal education policy with Charlie. And in particular, a concern about whether this new Trump administration might be itching to waive parts of the Every Student Succeeds Act, especially its testing and accountability requirements. Let's talk about that on Ed Reform Update. All right, Charlie, I should let our listeners know, if somehow they don't know, you have worked on federal education policy for a long time. You are one of the OG policy guys at the federal level. You were there in the room where it happens when No Child Left Behind was being negotiated, working for George Miller, Democrat from California, one of the, quote, big four in Congress as that went through. You'd been there before that as well. So you've been tracking this a long time. You wrote a piece recently for the National Parents Union blog expressing concern that this administration that talks a lot about sending power back to the states could actually waive a bunch of the testing requirements, the annual testing requirements that go back to No Child Left Behind. I would imagine a lot of our listeners are thinking, wait, what? They can do that? Isn't that in the law? Don't they have to do that? Tell us how this would work and why you're worried about it.
Yeah, I would first say, nobody knows what this administration is going to do. This administration doesn't seem to know what it's going to do. Last week, it was poised to roll out an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education on Thursday. They had sent out real signals they were doing that. And then an hour or two before that, they told everybody that was fake news. But who knows? That could happen at any time. But here's what we do know. They have said they want to dismantle the department. They have said they want to send education back to the states. In the statute, you have all of the policy provisions that are in Titles 1, 2, 3, etc. But in something called Title 8, there are what are called general provisions. And among those general provisions are a list of things that cannot be waived. Anything that's not on that list, you can waive, right? So this was put into law, I remember, back in the early to mid 90s, because the Clinton administration wanted to have waiver authority so that they could, in theory, give some states waivers in return for greater accountability. That mostly didn't happen, which is a lesson in and of itself. There was flexibility, but very little accountability. Out of that waiver program, however, did come Texas and disaggregation of data. And, annual measurable objectives for subgroups and all those good things. So some good came out of it. But anyway, they exist in law because there was a time when we had administration that explicitly wanted to waive some things. So on that list are things including the distribution of money to states and districts. There are very particular formula in law that dictate mathematically how funds are allocated to states and to school districts. You
And to be clear, that cannot be waived.
cannot be waived. That is on the list of cannot be waived.
Right.
Quote unquote applicable civil rights provisions cannot be waived. Applicable is not defined. So maybe sometime we'll hear that debate around that. But what is not on the list of things that cannot be waived is assessments and accountability. And they are some of the most exacting provisions in the entire statute. So you would think logically, if you wanted to give states flexibility in terms of all the things that they're asked to do that are fairly detailed and exacting, that would be toward the top of the list.
Okay.
So that's one reason for keeping a close eye on it, because
And we should say that, of course, these provisions have been waived, most famously in 2020 when the COVID pandemic hit. And Secretary DeVos told states, okay, it's a pandemic. You don't have to test students this year. Right.
which made perfect sense, right?
Yeah. Right. And then there was a debate in 2021 as the Biden administration came in where they sort of said, all right, we're done with that waiver authority. You need to get back to testing kids. And some states didn't do it and they didn't really get in trouble. Yeah. All right. So this has happened. And of course, we'd say, all right, well, a pandemic, that's a reasonable case. But does this mean they can just wake up one day? Oklahoma, let's say, wakes up, Ryan Walters, state superintendent, says, I don't want to test kids this year, sends in a waiver request, and Linda McMahon, carte blanche, could just say, okay, that's fine with me. There's no strings attached. I thought that there was some requirement, some language saying, if you're going to waive things like assessments, it has to result in having greater information for parents.
I mean, there are policies that exist in the department that require that, but they're not like written in stone. And this is an administration that's paying particularly close attention to the fine print. So I would say if a state wanted to have certain things waived, they could, as you posited, go to the feds and just say, I would like these things waived. And they could offer rationales for why they think more information might come out of such a system. It wouldn't be hard to make that argument. Then it could be argued back and forth. So just 2 weeks ago, a Republican California state legislator introduced a bill through which districts could opt out of the state system. That is something that many in the education establishment, particularly on the left, have been looking for years, because they don't like being able to compare districts. They don't like disaggregating data and comparing the performance of subgroups. They think those are unfair. It's what George W. Bush called the soft bigotry of low expectations. That's a real thing. So if California passed that law, and that legislator knows full well that they would not be able to do that under the current regime, that there would have to be a waiver, they could argue, well, look, there'd be more data, right? Districts could do all these creative things in terms of collecting other types of data and being more multimodal, and not just using multiple choice. So it would become a back and forth like that. But under that kind of proposal, which is only one of many possible outcomes, you would lose the ability to compare. And that's one of the advantages we have with the system that's in law now. You have apples to apples comparisons across districts and between subgroups, and losing that would be a big thing.
Yeah, I mean, and that does seem like I mean, from what we know from Linda McMahon, she seems quite reasonable. She has hired some great people: Penny Schwinn to be deputy secretary, Kirsten Basler to be assistant secretary elementary and secondary. These are not people that you would think would be in support of just getting rid of assessment and accountability. That certainly wasn't their position in other times that they've been in power at the state level for Penny and Kirsten. So, but maybe there's something more nuanced, right? If somebody says, well, we're not getting rid of testing, it's just that we're going to get rid of the statewide test. Or, we want to move away from annual testing because we think it's too frequent and we want to do some kind of sample assessment. You start to kind of play this out, right? That, if there was some openness to doing things differently, then you could imagine states coming forward with those sorts of ideas. So, I mean, I guess the question for you, Charlie, would be, what's your argument to say, no, it is not a good idea to open the door to any of that? Some people will call that innovation. You would call it what? The soft bigotry of low expectations. Explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, what we have in current law now is a result of years of negotiation, right? When back in 2015, when they were going to revise No Child Left Behind, Senator Lamar Alexander, who was the chair of the Senate Education Committee at the time, was conflicted about what he wanted to do. He wasn't sure whether or not he wanted to require continued, annual testing in grades 3 through 8 for all kids in math and reading, once in each grade span for science, and disaggregation of data. But through like the debate and negotiation, I think what we wound up with was what most people thought you needed. And if you lose any one component of that, then you lose important things. If you don't test every year, one thing you lose is the ability to generate longitudinal data where you follow students from year to year. That's something, right, that the anti-assessment and accountability folks used to complain about, because back on the old pre-NCLB system, we didn't have annual testing. We had testing every 3 years, roughly, right? Every 3-4 years, depending on the type of school. And the complaint was, for people who are attacking that system, is that you could only compare this year's cohort to last year's cohort, or that kind of thing. And so what we really needed was the ability to measure progress. And so we test kids every grade to do progress, right? So that provision's in there for a reason. So you lose the annual and you go to semi-annual or just certain grade spans, you lose the ability to track longitudinally. Second example, testing a sample of kids versus testing all kids. Yeah, you could test a sample of kids, and people argue that, the NAEP, for example, assesses states and it only samples some kids. But when you're trying to get a read on what's happening at every school, if you don't test every kid, you lose data. And you particularly lose the ability to disaggregate. If you don't test every kid, you test a sample, you may not have enough Black kids to break out the data for Black kids. You may not have enough, students with disabilities to break out the data for student disabilities. So you start to lose the ability to examine some of the subgroups. Maybe that would be attractive to this administration. Disaggregation of data is kind of DEI, right? I'm wondering to see how they approach this, because it's
Charlie, don't say that. I'm wanting you to make a positive case for this stuff. Come on.
I'm just saying, I doubt I'm pointing anything out to anybody that they haven't already thought of.
Yes.
So I'm trying to be honest with our listeners here. But, everything is there for a reason. I think we're down to the bare bones. Would the world end if we lost certain things? No, but you would lose important data, and we would be able to do less with the data than we're able to do now.
Yeah. And again, this is assuming that there's some kind of nuanced position rather than just, you don't want to test kids, stop testing kids. We don't care.
That's right. What we're hearing, right? And, there's
right.
like politically, there's at least three things going on here. There's the White House, there's Doge, and then there's Linda McMahon, Penny Schwinn, Kirsten, et cetera. So you got kind of like what the White House wants to do, what Doge wants to do, and what the incoming leadership wants to do. That may all be in conflict.
Yeah.
The other thing you have is it's an evolving dynamic. Like the leads here McMahon, Schwinn, and Baszler, maybe they come in not wanting it, but because people smell blood in the water, they start asking for things, and you get movement to change things, and it becomes politically more difficult to say no. What we're hearing is they're thinking about what they're trying to do, and they want to maintain some guardrails, but they do want to provide some state flexibility on something. And I'm not saying they definitely want to do that on assessments and accountability, but that's definitely in the mix. So we just don't know. So I'm
That's
just
interesting.
thinking,
Yeah.
the possibility that it's legal to do this.
Mhm.
There are some political dynamics out there that would cause one to think that some states might want to do that. And then it's going to depend on, the people you mentioned to try to argue for what's best for students, what's best for our ability to gauge how U.S. students are achieving and which schools are doing a good job and with which kids.
Yeah. So maybe what those of us that don't want to give up on annual testing, we need to come up with some other ideas for ways they can provide big flexibility to the states on some other issues, maybe. David, I mean, what do you think? I feel like here here it is again, maybe the sort of the left or the center left or the center trying to defend the status quo from being overturned. I mean, is this a fight worth fighting to try to maintain annual testing? What do you think?
Yeah, it's very much worth fighting. We cannot assess any of our efforts if we don't assess students, right? We don't know what our return on investment is. We don't know if we're closing achievement gaps. We don't know if we're making progress on recovering from the pandemic. We just don't know. And I do think some of the challenge, as sort of Charles has alluded to, is that the devil's kind of in the details a little bit, and there are things that sound reasonable or worth exploring, that it's not hard to imagine going very wrong in practice, testing every other year, that sort of thing. It doesn't sound unreasonable at face value, but I think it has a lot of very real costs once you get into it. And it's, it makes me really nervous to even hear about it. I'm not sure what else to say, except, I think that the challenge is fundamentally that support for testing is a mile wide and an inch deep. And maybe it's deeper than that among policy wonks, but we're a very small group. So I think, we all just need to think strategically, right, about how to sound the alarm here and sort of what our lines of defense are going to be, and what themes are really going to resonate with people. We've been wonking it out here, but I think, sort of more emotional, political, narrative-based themes might be the way to go when we're talking about this to people in general. Because what people really care about are, how kids are doing, how the next generation's doing, yada, yada, yada. They don't really care about sort of data integrity.
Well, and in terms of making the argument, no offense, Charlie, it is not to say to them that, hey, if you want to cut DEI, you should cut disaggregated data. Though, again, I think you're right that there is some overlap there. But it's the argument about giving a huge victory to Randy Weingarten and the teachers' unions, right? I mean, does Linda McMahon, does Donald Trump really want to be the ones to give the unions what they've been wanting for over a quarter century, right? Which is to kill off these annual testing requirements. And, maybe there's some people in Trump orbit who are serious about, this union friendly version of the Republican Party. But I don't know. I think most people still on the right, view the teachers unions as still such an impediment to improvement and good things in education that, that's pretty compelling. I think that may be our best argument is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Look, your enemy desperately wants to get rid of testing so that they don't have to have this public transparency anymore about the negative results. We don't need to have these comparisons anymore between urban charter schools and traditional public schools that show the charter schools outperforming on and on and on. And I think we just got to keep reminding our friends inside the administration that, this is going to be like the hugest gift, the biggest gift they could ever give to Randy Weingarten. Are they sure they want to do that?
And I made that point in the piece, right? That the unions fought these provisions in the ESSA law pretty hard. And 10 years later, I know there's still hard feelings that they lost. Like, there's just evidence of that if you get in a room with them for any extended period of time. Lamar Alexander picked and chose, right? He did some things that they didn't like. And then there was one spot when they were voting on their bill in committee in 2015 where he put the amendment through to gut the accountability provisions that the administration had done through an administrative process that wasn't clear they had the authority to do in law. And, the NAA lobbyists jumped up and ran to hug Lamar's top staffer in the hearing room. And that was reported in Education Week. So he didn't mind in that case. But, I hope what people realize is not just that the enemy or your enemy is your friend, but like they oppose this stuff for the wrong reason. Like they don't want the transparency. They don't want the scrutiny. That's not in the interest of kids. That's not in the interest of parents. At NPU, we see support for testing pretty high in our polling, around 75, 80%. I think, though, David raises a good point that it may be high, but it may not be, in many cases, strong. You have to see when it gets put to the test, right? Because the other thing we do see in our parent polling is parents want more data than just academic data. Like they want to see a range of things about their kids. So I could see, a counter proposal made that they'd scale back on the academics a little bit and come up with more school quality factors, school climate, student perceptions of schooling, different things that parents might like, and roll it into a more attractive package. So we'll see what happens. Maybe we're about to embark on a big national experiment, and we'll see if we learn from the results of the experiment. But I'm hoping there's support for maintaining the guardrails. Either we do it inside the Beltway or we fight it out state by state.
All right. We will need to leave it there. Charlie Barone at the National Parents Union. Thanks so much for joining us again, Charlie. Hope you'll come back sometime soon.
My pleasure.
All right. Now it's time for everyone's favorite, Amber's Research Minute. Amber, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mike.
So has spring sprung down there in Richmond, Virginia?
It's pretty warm today. I think it's 65. So, hey, I'm not complaining. I'm liking it.
I think we may have made it. I don't know. It feels pretty good.
Yes, it does.
I had that last week, guys.
Okay. All right, David. That's fine. All right. The question for you, David, how painful was daylight savings time with small children? I remember that being very difficult.
It wasn't so bad. We live just a couple blocks from our elementary school. We're very fortunate, so we can wake them up and hand them a banana and send them out the door and get them to school on time.
Okay.
So it was a little difficult getting them to bed on time.
Yes,
so.
That is what I remember. Is the I always remember whose idea was this that suddenly I can't get my kid to go to sleep. I thought Trump promised he was going to get rid of this, Amber, daylight saving. What happened to that? Next year?
Don't know. Wouldn't put it past him.
All right, gang. Well, enough about the weather. Amber, tell us about research. What you got for us this week?
I think this is a cool study. Obviously, we don't typically do higher ed stuff, but this is about student loans, so it definitely has to do with our world. We're looking at the impact of the largest student loan forgiveness event in U.S. history. Folks will remember specifically starting in March 2021, under the Biden administration, the U.S. federal government forgave over $132 billion in student loans, or close to 8% of the total $1.7 trillion in outstanding student debt. So this is an NBER study conducted by 4 economists. They analyzed how forgiveness was targeted and its impact on the forgiven borrower's consumption, debt, and earnings. All right. Primary analysis is a difference in differences design, compares how a borrower's outcomes change over time upon receiving loan forgiveness compared to borrowers who have not yet received loan forgiveness. They use TransUnion consumer credit data to assess lines of credit, payments, and credit scores, as well as another large credit bureau for employment verification and income verification. They take a 25% random sample that consists of all borrowers who have an open student loan as of January 2021, which resulted in roughly 993,000 borrowers. So a pretty impressive study. The loan forgiveness started with a pause in loan forgiveness, as we may recall, for all borrowers in 2020 under the pandemic. That pause ultimately lasted 3.5 years until October 2023. So after Biden's original cancellation plan was deemed unconstitutional, I think we all remember that, his administration went back to the drawing board and they changed several policies to expand eligibility, retroactively count payments, and simplify the process. So that included one change that said that any borrowers who had made the required number of payments would receive automatic forgiveness. And that seemed to be the big one. That resulted in $46 billion of discharge debt at around $49,000 per borrower. But when you look at all the different policies, because that wasn't the only one, there were different ways that they changed the rules. Across all of the revised policies, the average forgiven balance totaled about $44,000, and the average age of the typical borrower is around 39. In part, 39 years of age, in part because of how they revised those policies. The fact that if you had already paid a certain number of payments, you got the automatic forgiveness. So it's skewing older and higher income. All right, key findings. The forgiven borrower's predicted monthly earnings were $115 higher than borrowers who did not yet receive forgiveness, and $193 more than the general population who also have a credit history. For each dollar of student loan forgiveness, this was what was super interesting, other debt increases by nearly 9 cents, the bulk of which is driven by mortgage debt. Specifically, for the 6 months following their loan forgiveness and up to 12 months, they find that increases in mortgage, auto, and credit card balances totaled approximately $2,800. The majority of that, a little over $2,300, is driven by mortgage increases, with the rest split between auto and credit card balances. So it appears that the forgiven borrowers opened new lines of credit, specifically new home mortgages, or they financed a new car, or in a smaller number of cases, they opened another credit card. In fact, households spent 27 to 57 times the amount of their monthly wealth shock because they were front-loading spending on durables like housing. All right, borrowers' monthly earnings dropped. This is something, but their monthly earnings dropped by $44 over the first 6 months and increased to $75 of a drop in month 7. Employment fell at increasing rates for each month of forgiveness, including a drop in the hours worked by hourly workers so that they made less. So all this suggests that the borrowers may have been in higher paying jobs, or they were maybe working an additional job to pay back their debt. But they also saw an exodus out of public service. So these forgiven borrowers, you may remember, you no longer had to work in public service to qualify for future forgiveness. So then we see a bunch of people leaving public service because they don't have to work there anymore. So that's what I've got. It's a lot. Interesting. And what do you make of it?
Wow. Well, it seems like there is something for everyone here. As I recall, there was an argument that said that a lot of people that have these student loan debts hanging around their necks, it meant they could not afford to buy homes. It was part of the reason that we have this messed up housing market, and that it would be good if people were able to, buy their first home instead. And so I guess you can say that that did happen. On the other hand, this is going to feed some of the populist anger over this loan forgiveness, this notion that people get this windfall and then choose to work less. Let me couch that. Let's say that in less soothing terms. That pisses me off. The idea that we've handed people a windfall and then they work less. Yeah, I don't know, David.
Yeah, I don't really disagree. It's not my favorite Biden administration policy. I do think it's a little tough without better data around, how many jobs they're holding and how much they're working, et cetera, and so forth. But yeah, I largely share that reaction, right? These are working age adults, most of them, right? 39 is not that old. I'm 40. You're supposed to be working in these years, I don't know. We all sometimes wish we could work a little bit less, right? But it's generally considered good to have workforce participation, and I think it all comes back to this question of how sympathetic this group is. To be honest, to inject some sort of normative thinking into the question, right? If you buy that this is like a sort of sympathetic group of people who have been burdened by debt for generations or, for decades and need sort of a helping hand to get out from underneath it, then maybe this doesn't strike you as so problematic. But I think I tend towards the position that, a lot of these folks are in higher paying jobs and are not sort of at the bottom of the economic ladder. So, it's not what I would consider priority spending, separate from kind of the procedural issues around how it was done.
Yeah. And Amber, it sounds like we do have data now that these people were a little bit above average in terms of income. Is that fair to say?
Yep.
Yeah. Right. So, probably not on average super wealthy, but certainly, again, above average, meaning
Right.
that a whole lot of people earning less than them did not get this same kind of windfall because they didn't go to college. Right. The public service stuff I think is interesting too. It gets so complicated. I know it's been a mess forever. I kind of listened to Corey Turner on NPR has dug into this for years. President Trump just announced an executive order to make more changes, which I don't quite understand. I mean, if we figured out a way to do it well, you would hope that it could be a real driver in getting people to teach in high need schools, for example, and we've got programs on the books that are supposed to do that. My sense is it hasn't worked as intended, but if we start to narrow loan forgiveness to people who, either really got taken advantage of by some, fraudulent colleges or are willing to serve. Again, high need school could be one thing. Of course, you serve in the military and you can have loans forgiven, right? Rather than just wipe it out altogether, right? But that's, I guess, the big question. Can we get smart enough on the policy side to tailor it more narrowly and to make it something that we could all feel proud about?
Right. And I feel like we used to have a couple of those, right? Where the teachers would get some loan forgiveness. I don't know if those were state level policies or but yeah, I'm with you, like trying to figure out how to actually get this to the folks that we want to benefit from this. Could use some additional thinking. I mean, on the one hand, I think, well, you don't really want to give it to people who just took out the loan. You want to reward the folks who've maybe been diligently paying and playing by the rules. And I don't know. I think it's very difficult, obviously, to get the policy incentives right, because once you kind of mess with one rule, you might end up disadvantaging somebody else that you don't want to. So, yeah, the mechanics of this are tricky.
Yeah, I mean, my gut reaction is that I'd rather just pay teachers more personally, right? I realize that this might be a more politically palatable or expedient route to doing that, but effectively, that's all it is, right? I mean, you're just finding a different way to pay teachers a little more at a different point in time, and it seems to me that the most efficient way to do that is to pay them more. And if we think they should work in particular places, pay them more to work in those places, instead of constructing some, I don't know, inherently complicated way of getting them to forgive loan forgiveness for, certain institutions and certain times and yada, yada, yada. I mean, you can see it coming apart at the seams, even as we try to talk about it. I don't know. I don't know that
The
ultimately
state,
that
though,
should be
then
changed.
is. Oh, sorry, Dave. I was just going to say the state and district are paying for the increases, though here they're not having to, right? Because these are federal forgiveness programs.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think you can make a case for the feds to do more, right? I'm not sure that this, I mean, I don't know, just give more money to high poverty schools, right? Like that's kind of where I'm at with it, right? If we think we should have better teachers in high poverty schools, give them more dollars per pupil and let them spend it the way they want to, including on more money for teachers.
Or make them spend it on higher salaries for teachers.
Right.
Maybe.
No, Mike, no, we're all good conservatives here, right? Let them make decisions based on local circumstances. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that sort of at a gut level, but I mean, it seems like we're just constructing really complicated ways to solve a really simple problem.
Okay. All right. Interesting stuff, Amber. Thank you for our foray into higher education. And yes, that trip down memory lane of that time when we decided to just forgive student loans, because, hey, it was like we didn't have enough national debt. What's a few, hundreds of billions of dollars more on the old credit card.
Yeah. Yep. That got me when they were opening new credit cards. I'm like, all right, buy a house, but opening more credit cards. Come on.
All right, gang. That is all the time we've got for this week. And so until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.